So our next speaker is Jim Diana. He's the director of Missions and Sea Grant College Program, and his topic is why do so many Americans react negatively to increasing aquaculture in the United States? Jim, thank you so much for coming out here and welcome to Idaho.
It's nice to be in Idaho. Thank you for having me. So I'm a researcher by history. I've done work in Southeast Asia in aquaculture for over 30 years. And I'm now the director of Michigan Sea Grant, have been for about 8 years. And when I started at Michigan Sea Grant, I sort of came up with the idea that I ought to be pushing aquaculture in the state. Not necessarily saying that we, need to develop every style of aquaculture everywhere, but bring aquaculture up as a priority in the state. And it wasn't a priority in the previous time. Let me see. So I'm going to show you some things that you've already seen and you already know. That's what professors do. We tell you something, we tell you what we told you, and we tell it again. And then probably the next lecture, we tell it again. So bear with me. But we all know that aquaculture has expanded pretty dramatically in recent years, and fisheries in general have stabilized over that time period. So I started working in aquaculture back in the mid-'80s, and it was about 8% of all the seafood that was produced, if we looked at just animals. In 2010, it was 38%. If we count it in terms of what we actually eat, it's over 50% now of the seafood that's produced. It's grown at a rapid rate. But that has been not shared in the United States. Here's a graph showing the increase in world production of aquaculture products, and in red, U.S. production of aquaculture products. You can see that the U.S. production is pretty low. If we try to scale that differently, you can see I've changed the axis now, so the axis on the left where the red is 1% of the total on the right. So for a while we've been a little above 1% of the world's production, and right now we're less than 1% of the world's production. Another thing that we always talk about, aquaculture is expanding fairly rapidly. On the world basis, about 9% per year, has been for quite a while. The U.S. basis, if we try to draw a line through that, it's about 2.5% per year. So we're not really seeing the same kind of change in the United States that we see worldwide. Our view of aquaculture is often something like this. This is a public citizen's view of aquaculture, at least in the state of Michigan. Dead fish, algal blooms, things you shouldn't eat. And it even gets to the point where most of us are accused of things like creating Frankenfish. I don't know how much you watch the Sci-Fi Network, but I love the Sci-Fi Network. And they're always showing mutant fish that are coming out and pulling people off the beach, created by some mad scientist at the University of Idaho who has decided to go and genetically manipulate their species. Sometimes it's some of these sharks that go so fast that they just kill everybody, and I don't know why people would want to create a fast shark, but apparently the public thinks that's what we do. So this is often the public view of aquaculture, unfortunately. Let's look at agriculture as a comparison. This is a wallpaper on the internet for your computer of farms. I haven't seen any wallpapers on the computer of fish farms, but people look at farms differently. I think they look at farms differently because we have a longer history of agriculture, so we kind of trust it, we know it, it's around us. We value it as green space in some ways, but we don't value aquaculture in the same way. And I even went to look for Frankencow, and Frankencow still looks pretty nice and friendly in comparison with Frankenfish. Another view of agriculture as being something we need and something that's natural and somewhat good. So I mentioned that at Michigan I decided we ought to really kind of highlight aquaculture. It fits with the Sea Grant mission. It fits with being in commerce. It fits with creating jobs and economy. And actually in the Great Lakes, both commercial fisheries and aquaculture are kind of ignored by our state agencies And so Sea Grant programs throughout the Great Lakes have taken a particular interest in promoting those. So what do we do at Michigan? We've had a long history of doing HACCP programs. I think Ron is still somewhere in the air between Detroit and here, but Ron Kinnunen will talk about that later. He's our agent who really focuses on HACCP programs. We've developed a number of fact sheets to try to inform the public about what aquaculture is in the state of Michigan and what it is globally. We funded an integrated assessment. In Michigan, we fund research as integrated assessments, which are really looking at difficult problems, trying to come up with a variety of ways you might solve those problems and bring that information to managers and policymakers to have them apply what they think is most appropriate for the problem in their area. So we funded an integrated assessment, which was really based on helping the Michigan Aquaculture Association come up with a strategic plan. Basically, this association didn't really have a goal in mind, didn't really have a clear idea of what aquaculture should be. At the same time, we started a series of things we call the Michigan Seafood Summit, which is during the day a series of meetings about aquaculture and commercial fisheries and how they might work together and all the good and bad points of the businesses and what needs to go on in the future. And then followed by a banquet, which involves both the public and the professionals in the area, with an attempt to try to get all those people to think together about the quality and the sustainability of seafood that's produced in Michigan. And that's been a pretty good success too. And then finally, we received a grant in aquaculture extension where we hired an extensionist who is now a permanent member of our team, even beyond the length of the grant. We are putting interns into businesses from local universities to try to teach them about aquaculture technology. We've been involved in developing GAMPs for aquaculture, community college curricula, to try to sort of build the industry, I guess, from the bottom up, from the people who are going to be doing aquaculture, with the idea that they would do it more sustainably if they're well trained. So let's talk a little bit about those, because much of this has been pretty controversial. I mentioned before, I'm not an extension educator, I'm a researcher. My people in Michigan Sea Grant say, please don't try to do any more extension. Because as I've tried to get involved in this whole area of aquaculture, I've just created what seems to be a public relations nightmare in a way. And I'll show you some of the reasons in a minute. But let's start off with our integrated assessment. Our integrated assessment, actually, Chris Weeks over here is the one who directed the integrated assessment, was a part of our normal grant process. We put out a request for proposals, different areas that we list as our interest. People submit proposals, they go through a scientific panel, and they decide on what projects should be funded. And one of them was this project on aquaculture. And the idea was to help the industry develop a plan for the future and where they want to go. And the important point is, it's not Sea Grant's plan. We don't really necessarily endorse the plan. What we do is we help the industry develop a plan. But we did help. I'll give it that. And it was involved with a lot of stakeholders and a lot of peer review before it was finally done. In fact, Chris will tell you more peer review than he ever thought would be involved. What did the plan say? The plan said that Michigan needs to step up in aquaculture. I guess if I wanted to make a short statement about the plan, I'd say they've decided they want to go into commercial scale food fish production, which is something that really wasn't a highlight in the past in Michigan aquaculture. And in fact, throughout much of the Great Lakes, that's not the highlight. Why? Well, the things we've heard already. Over 90% of our seafood is imported. A lot of it we have reasons to question its quality. We have population growth and consumption changes that create new demand. And in Michigan, we have some really unique characteristics. We have a lot of water. We have most of the Great Lakes. We have large inland lakes. We have rivers and streams. We have groundwater. Water is something that we really can capitalize on easily. We have expertise. We've had commercial fisheries in the Great Lakes since the 1800s, and so we know something about fish processing and fish marketing. And that history of agriculture, which is also a thing. Kellogg's come from Michigan, for crying out loud. So we have a lot that kind of prepares us for doing aquaculture. On the other hand, there's also the concern that we might cause damage, and so we have to be careful about not causing undue harm. And that, I think, is one of the questions that we really need to deal with, because everything we do creates some change, probably some harm. And we have to think of it in a relative scale. How does aquaculture compare with agriculture in terms of the damages produced? Not just does aquaculture change clean water into something slightly different. Of course it does. Does it change it any worse than runoff from agricultural fields? Those are the kinds of questions we ought to be dealing with, since we are talking about a productive industry. Okay, so the concepts in the strategic plan: expand aquaculture to about $1 billion industry by 2025. It's not going to happen at the rate things are moving right now. Do so by using 3 main systems: raceways, recirculating, and cage culture. Start with expanding existing systems and move out, and then try to develop the whole industry. That is not just fish production, but feed production, seed production, marketing, the whole process. And I won't spend a lot of time on this, but all 3 of these methods that we talk about expanding in aquaculture are methods that have been evaluated as being reasonably sustainable. So, for example, here's I'm using the Monterey Bay Aquarium's Seafood Watch program as their analysis. Raceway culture is considered a best choice for rainbow trout in the United States. It's the most common system used in Michigan today for aquaculture, and it also is a huge program when we start looking at state salmon and trout hatcheries. So the raceway culture system, it seems like, from a public perception, ought to be pretty good, because really you're talking about something that's been evaluated as being fairly sustainable. Recirculating aquaculture, everybody thinks recirculating aquaculture is the future, is the thing that is going to be the most sustainable type. Of course, the question becomes, can you afford to do it? Because much of the time the cost exceeds the value of the crop. But it's developing in the US, more common in Europe, and again, it gets a best choice anytime you really look at its ecological impacts. Cage culture in the Great Lakes was a proposal they made that was pretty controversial, because the Great Lakes are generally seen as being public property that's used for recreation, but not really used for commercial gain, at least in most cases. There are cage culture operations in Ontario producing about 12 million pounds of fish a year, but not in the United States water. But it is common on both of our coasts in saltwater, and it's also common in the Columbia River for rainbow trout. And that system is also given a best choice by the Seafood Watch program. But the fears are that all the Atlantic salmon culture that goes on throughout the world has been pretty controversial in terms of its ecological effects. And the people in the state of Michigan, at least, look at that as being what's likely to happen when we do cage culture in the Great Lakes. And of course, that evaluation shows it to be not a sustainable choice at all. Well, as we started to expand in aquaculture, we've seen really nothing but controversy. The net pen situation in the Great Lakes is one that I'll talk about, and I'll steal a little bit of what Chris is going to talk about on Thursday. And the Grayling fish hatchery is another one. Both of these have showed up in the newspapers like crazy, and we've tried our best through Sea Grant to try to give unbiased sort of scientific information to the development, but often that's been interpreted as being pro-aquaculture. And it's kind of surprised me that the Grayling fish hatchery even made it into an article in the New York Times, which seems pretty odd for just a small hatchery in one state quite a bit removed from New York. But let's start with net pens. So because of the strategic plan, the government in Michigan decided that they needed to figure out what are they going to do about permitting net pens. And so they said, let's go out for pre-permit applications. We'll ask people if they're interested in doing this or not. 2 came in, and they had a hearing for one of those pre-permits. And at that hearing, they decided, we don't know what we're doing. We have no idea how to permit or regulate net pens. And so let's set up an expert panel to give us advice on what we should do. And the we in this case is the state departments of Ag and Rural Development, Environmental Quality, and Natural Resources. They call those the quality of life programs. So I was a part of that panel, and we spent about 6 months working on it, and eventually in October we came up with a report, which you can find on the internet if you really want to see it. And the state also had a small market evaluation done to see what the potential market could be for aquaculture from net pens in the Great Lakes. Well, after the panel came through, here was our recommendations. We weren't asked to tell them yes or no. We were asked to give them advice on what to do if they went forward. All right, so we thought they should use adaptive management. Everybody says that. It's a nice buzzword. Monitor carefully before and after control and impact studies. That was something that we really felt strongly about. Start slowly, develop some best practices before you get too far. And really, in terms of the Great Lakes, 2 issues came out as very important. One was siting, because you're looking at, we don't have tidal exchange. We do have currents and waves, but they often get well beyond what we might want to do in aquaculture. And so finding a place that had enough flushing but not too much turbulence was a real problem. And then finally, pay attention to ice. I mean, that's the one thing that's really the most different between Great Lakes culture and other places is what will ice do and how will you manage for ice? It's not that you can't manage for ice, but it is a unique component of our system. Well, the state, in all its wisdom, decided not to recommend pursuing net pen aquaculture because they thought it would pose risks to the recreational fishery, that it would cost them money to manage. And then the last of all, the one that killed me, they didn't have the regulatory authority to even allow it to happen. They said the bottomlands of the Great Lakes are public property and could not be used for commercial purposes. And that was the state attorney general's evaluation. I wish he had told us 6 months before we started evaluating all this, because there was no reason to even consider it if it couldn't be done in any case. It surprises me also that net pens can't be put in, but marinas can be put in on the same land. Not really a logic there. I think that could be changed. Anyway, what did we learn? On the left, you can't read it necessarily, but I did a Google search on net pens in the Great Lakes. And let me see the number here. 238,000 results. It got, not every one of those is all, articles about net pens in the Great Lakes, but there was a lot. There was a lot of interest and controversy. What did the public think? They thought net pens are dirty and they'll foul the Great Lakes. They thought that escaped fish from these net pens would degrade natural populations. The Great Lakes are better for public use. This was an interesting argument because the people who really brought that up the most were charter fishers who actually use that to sell fishing to other people and make their living from the Great Lakes. Why that's a greater public use is not clear. Economic value of aquaculture is fairly poor. And then really, if you looked at public comments, over 75% of the people were against net pens. These groups included the Michigan United Conservation Clubs, Trout Unlimited, the Michigan Environmental Council, the Sierra Club. So some pretty big NGOs. And they really, I think, drove the decision. And in my mind, these groups were relatively uninformed about the issues. They had made up their mind before this started, didn't really listen to scientific evidence, had already made their decision and pushed it in the future. All right, so I'm not saying that we should have net pens in the Great Lakes necessarily. I think with that kind of a public response, we shouldn't. But I do think that the public response largely resulted from the NGO groups and their concerns. Well, the second operation has happened in Michigan, and it's a hatchery on Grayling, in Grayling on the Au Sable River. It was originally a state fish hatchery by the DNR for producing fish to stock. It was converted to a tourist site 20 or 30 years ago, and people pay to get some fish feed and throw it to trout and watch them feed, and people like that, and the city likes it. It's a nice little tourist trap. In 2014, it was abandoned by the owner, and another person was asked to come in and take over that. He got a lease for it, and put in a permit to expand culture. They were producing about 20,000 pounds of trout or less. Now he wanted to go up to 300,000 pounds, and that requires an NPDES permit. He got a permit from the Department of Environmental Quality in 2014, and then there was a suit against the Department of Environmental Quality saying that the permit should have never been issued to stop the farm. And again, the Sierra Club and the Anglers of the Au Sable were the two groups. In 2017, after a long series of hearings, the judge finally supported the idea that the permit was valid and should be allowed. So it took 3 years to go through that process, at which point the judge said in February this year that it should be allowed. Well, the Anglers of the Au Sable then went legislative. They took it to circuit court, alleging that it was a violation of Michigan's Environmental Protection Act, and that's just now starting. And then one of our congressmen, Kildee, who's a Democrat in Michigan, introduced 2 federal bills restricting aquaculture, which really were mainly in response to these 2 issues. But let me show you once again. Here we've got another Google search on the Grayling fish farm, and we've got 50,000 results. So again, a lot of comments and controversy around this. So what did Kildee's office introduce? He introduced 2 acts, really. One was to ban aquaculture in the Great Lakes. Basically take what the state of Michigan did and say that should occur throughout the United States. Secondly, to ban aquaculture on waters that connect to wild and scenic rivers, unless they can be shown to not discharge any pollutants in the river. Now, these 2 acts are federal, not state, so they're going to influence a lot of people beyond the state of Michigan. It's both, the second one in particular is really a reaction to the Au Sable River situation. And in my mind, the Au Sable River situation would probably pass that act and be able to continue anyway, because the way it's set up right now, most likely they'll show they're not polluting when they're all done. What happened on the Au Sable? Well, phosphorus discharge into the river was a big concern. Also, disease increase that might occur downstream into one of the premier trout fishing streams in the United States. It was probably not the greatest idea to start with expanding aquaculture on one of our premier trout streams, but it happened. It even got to the point of introducing exotic organisms. We have an introduction of the New Zealand mud snail. A lot of us have seen that. And they were trying to blame that on the fish farm, even though most people know that that's been spread around by anglers on their boats and on their waders more than it has any other source. All of these would damage the holy waters where the Trout Unlimited was founded, and a multi-million-dollar tourist trade in their minds. And again, Anglers of the Au Sable, Sierra Club, and Michigan Environmental Council and MUCC are all involved in this series of concerns. Well, I was surprised to see how people reacted to trying to provide scientific evidence for or against aquaculture, and to use that to help make decisions. Kind of the most surprising of all of these, I guess. So after this was done this year, we went around and did site visits in Detroit on the Hill, and one of the offices I went to was Kildee's office, and it was right after this. And I went with our university lobbyist, and the lobbyist told me, now don't talk about aquaculture. So sure enough, the first thing that came up was the Aquaculture Act, and I basically just said that I felt that those 2 acts are not necessary, that the states ought to be able to regulate things, their agencies that are responsible ought to be able to do it. Well, they didn't like that. So next thing I know, there's a National Sea Grant Office meeting with Kildee to explain why I'm promoting aquaculture in the state. And then last Saturday, I actually got an email from one of his staff members saying, I heard a rumor that you're going to retire. Is it true? So I can just tell you now, it is true. I actually retired July 1st from teaching at the University of Michigan, but I will remain at least another year with Sea Grant. Anyway, obviously, they don't like that involvement. So aquaculture is here to stay. I think many projects and businesses improve the environmental footprint of aquaculture as we move along, and we're going to see more acceptance over time. In Michigan, both rural and urban areas could really benefit from this. We have some bad situations in many of our cities, and particularly in many of our small coastal towns where there used to be commercial fishing and now there is not. And a small business like an aquaculture firm that maybe produced a couple million pounds of fish would probably make a huge difference in a community like Nobbinway. We need to regulate aquaculture like we do any other business, like we do agribusinesses, and think of it comparably. And we need more successes. We need to see financial success from aquaculture to really see it be accepted well. On the negative side, many people have already made up their minds, and unfortunately they've made up their minds against aquaculture, and scientific facts don't seem relevant to many of these people. We live in an age where, you know, people question science all the time. Often those who are against aquaculture don't like to lose. We're talking rich doctors and lawyers, and they'll take it to the Supreme Court. If they have their chance, they will take the Grayling hatchery to the Supreme Court. I don't think the Supreme Court is foolish enough to take that on as a case, but they would do that. And most of them don't see the value in the economy or the seafood safety issues that we talk about. Most of them have the NIMBY attitude, if you really want to look at what they think about aquaculture. So what can we do? I think we have some real questions. How do we help expand this dialogue? How do we get these NGOs involved in thinking about the reality of aquaculture and its potential in the future, and its good and bad points? How do we educate people who don't want to hear what we're trying to educate them about? How do we get these decisions out of the hands of politicians and into the responsible agencies who actually will do the evaluation and analysis? And I would question whether we're really capable of commercial scales of aquaculture on inland waters, at least in states like Michigan, where there is such a strong feeling about the damages that could be done by aquaculture and a huge response against it. So I think things are questionable. I think we really have to focus what we do, and I guess into the future it seems to me that this whole process has got to have to change in a way that we are more effective at influencing those groups that really seem to make public sentiment. And with that, I'd just say thanks for listening, and I don't think I have any time for questions either.
All right, take one or two questions, a couple minutes.
Okay.
Thank you, Jim. I have a quick question. That facility, the Grayling facility, the river, the fish that they fish for is rainbow trout, correct?
Well, rainbow and brown trout, mostly brown trout.
Both
Actually.
native species
Yeah.
in Michigan, correct? Okay.
Yeah.
And then I know the farmer that bought that place. He made a presentation at U.S. Trout Farmers a year or so ago. Actually, when the state hatchery existed, the fishery in the river was actually better than when after they quit because the water is very unproductive.
That's absolutely true. I was asking about the productivity of the river. There was actually a person from the Michigan DNR who testified that more phosphorus would result in better trout fishing in the Osable River.
I don't know if you have an answer to this, but how do you fight NGOs when they control the message and some of these NGOs are actually set up in order to sue because if it goes to court, they get their attorney fees paid. So it's a fundraising opportunity. They don't care about the facts. It's about making money for them.
Oh, I don't know how you fight that. That's what I'm hoping all you wise people in Extension do. I tried direct confrontation, and that didn't work, unfortunately. No, that's all I guess I should say now. he is filming this.
Hey Jim, what was the policymakers' main concern about aquaculture when you visited them on the Hill?
So it was just the one that I talked about aquaculture with, and his concern was, that he felt like aquaculture was not appropriate for a state for every reason, from water quality damage to damage to recreation, and Didn't just want it to be our state, wanted it to be throughout the United States. That I think is the part that's most difficult.
Funds were coming from an NGO.
Yeah.
An unfortunate, uninformed congressman. So
There aren't many.
yeah.